movements, African and European insecurities. And the panel will also look at protests as migration and the global political economy, so African responses to a global challenge. And really, the exercise today is part of the Fellows training during their 12 months here at King's. The African Leadership Center Fellowship programs and activities have been designed to support the center's vision to building a new community of leaders that generate cutting-edge knowledge on peace and security. And we offer two types of fellowship programs: degree awarding programs and non-degree programs. So the degree awarding programs is the Peace and Security Fellowship for African Scholars, and that involves a 12-month training here at King's, where young junior academics in universities in Africa come to King's and do the MSc Security and Leadership, MSc Security, Leadership and Society, also offered here by the ALC. And then they go on a 6-month attachment to a university on the continent. And our non-degree awarding program is the Peace and Security Women Fellowship Program. And it's where young mid-career women go to our office in Nairobi, to the center in Nairobi, to do a 6-month training program. And then they also go on attachment for 6 months at a regional organization on the continent. So in essence, what you're going to see today is a core part of the ALC fellowship program. And it's basically a high-level role-play simulation where the fellows will debate and act out real-life situations relating to significant security situations in Africa. And the sessions is kind of an opportunity for the fellows to display their analysis of current affairs from a variety of perspectives. And often these perspectives are not how they think themselves, but they have to defend those positions. So we hope you'll be able to join in that, in engaging with them. But before I introduce the panel, we'll have some introductory remarks from Professor Fumi Olonisakin, who is the founding director of the center and is currently the Vice Dean International within the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Nyanka. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, thank you. I love a bit of feedback every now and again. Thank you, Nyanka. It's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome again, this time to King's College, London. Typically, on this annual, at this annual simulation seminars, we tend to focus on a number of events in Africa. Those who are familiar with the simulation seminars now will see something really different about this year's agenda or topic of this debate. And there's several reasons why. I don't think that we can talk about an Africa that is disconnected from the rest of the world anymore. Not only is it not fashionable anymore, it is also not a true reflection of the global realities. And so, because times are changing, because things are changing, I want to depart from my normal introductory remarks, at least in the past when I had a chance to take this podium. I would like to offer some kind of thematic introduction to this subject. It's an unusual subject. For the ALC, it's no longer unusual because we want to send a message with it. I think it's important to send a message. And I want to thank Eka for stimulating my brain to help me to get thinking about what all of this means for leadership in another context. But I thought that I'll offer some of this thinking at today's simulation seminar with something that I'm calling accidents of history and coincidences of misfortune. And by saying that, I would like to use 3 interconnecting narratives. I want to give an introduction about conversation, contestation, and coincidences. All right? when it comes to the convergence of African and European security, which is what we're talking about today. I think we know that 3 events began to draw attention to the changes and to the folly of disconnecting Africa from the rest of the world. One is the migration crisis that we saw in Europe. 2, of course, is Brexit. And 3 is Trumphalism, if you can call Trump's emergence in the US that. All right? They changed narratives. We don't even know that people are aware that narratives about Africa have changed in terms of its relationship to the rest of the world. They changed a big narrative, and that's what I think we should focus on as we begin to think about today's debate, and we listen to our debaters today and our panelists today. That idea that African voices and events in Africa are largely disconnected from Europe, I think we can scrap that narrative for good. Not least because globalization had been pointing us in that direction for some time. But if you sit in Europe or in the US, which seems very much like a fortress, you'll think, well, hungry Africans don't matter. The voices really, you can keep listening to it. Okay, yes, you see them on Facebook, you see them in different other fora. If we have tight immigration policies, we can keep the hungry away, we can keep the ambitious away, and we can keep the notorious away. And take only a snippet of the wealthy elite, those who match our own, who look like us, who speak like us, talk like us, and have resources to give to us. We can keep them away from Europe and the rest of the world. Europe in particular, on this occasion. But let's see how 3 sets of conversations have produced these coincidences of misfortune, but actually a connection, the most unlikely connection amongst Africans, Europeans, and Americans. The first set of conversation has to be the age-old conversation in Africa, which in our books, in the literature, and in the media, you know, they're so familiar. Actually, we're jaded when we listen to these conversations, when we just watch from a distance how ordinary people are talking to their governments or their elites. We see who's talking and who's talking back and how they're talking. That's the notion of conversation here. It's not just about a dialogue or an open discussion. But you can find conversation, and I take this back from, I try to adapt this from the notion of conversation in Europe's long 18th century. If you go back to the conversation in the long 18th century in Europe, the idea of what goes on in the public sphere is what you find in the literature. But also the idea that those discourses are not just about the overt conversations that we have in coffee houses, but you can bring art into it and see how one piece of art is in conversation with another, isn't it? For those who are not familiar with this, I've found the work of Jürgen Habermas very, very fascinating in this area. You have a lot of fascinating literature. If you impose the notion of conversation on the events and the antecedents of the events of the last few years, you begin to see closely, and we saw in Africa, the nature of the conversation. It was about the silent and the excluded who were talking back to their leaders in a number of ways. The conversible spaces, as you call it you can call it in the literature, were not always the political spaces. But what we saw very, very easily were the elections, who was elected, how they were elected, and some of the dynamics around this. What we saw were political discourses, and then openly, glaringly, we saw the aftermath or the impact of those things in the poverty and expression of poverty. And we disconnected all of this from conversations where governments talked to people through their policies, through the decisions that they made, which excluded them. But those people were talking back through silence. When they talk back through silence, everything is fine as far as Europe is concerned. There's stability in Africa. So therefore, what is this that we're talking about, a new form of security regime for Africa? And also when they talk back by retreating from the state, away from their governments, and doing their own thing, all right? In terms of informal economy, in terms of sometimes very interesting creative things going on, theater, art, and many artists talk back in Africa. Many musicians talk back. Their art speaks to you. But we're far removed. You don't hear what they're saying. Sometimes we hear it when the music is unveiled, as was unveiled in Sierra Leone during times of election. Then leaders change because young people are speaking passionately. In Senegal, that was what that movement was about, led by young people. When you saw it in the theater, it jolts you, you laugh about it, and I now know that many Africans are on WhatsApp with all manner of jokes about their leaders and so on. But they're separate, you know, they're noticed separately and they're articulated separately by the watchers of that space. The only time that we take a look and we say, my goodness, what's going on in Africa, is when that conversation starts getting very public and very publicly violent. Violence is conversation, in this notion of conversation. It is not some odd event that has taken place in isolation of the larger picture. But the narrative of those leaders against whom people are protesting, and protest I'm coming to in a minute, or, you know, protesting through violence, the narrative is about these ruffians, thugs, and the odd, misbehaving, marauding youth who should be punished or excluded even more. But there are two other forms of conversation taking place. When people talk back through protestation that does not have violence at the heart of it, and through protestation that is so evident, so widespread and massive, we begin to see a bit of shift. It speaks to the conscience of the rest of the world, and then the leaders maybe make a little bit of room. But we have seen in Africa, in the northern part of Africa, for example, what everybody has termed the Arab Spring, when people spoke back because of triggers, in a particular kind of trigger in Tunisia. We saw how powerful that was. When people spoke back through those mass protests in Egypt, we saw how powerful it was. And when they tried to speak back in Libya, we saw how the dynamics changed because other people joined the conversation and weighed in ways that made, you know, that conversation a little bit inauthentic, maybe far more inauthentic than we wanted it to be. So let's pack the African conversation as something that we need to connect later. That conversation, as powerful as it's been through centuries, assumed a particular form previously. And it was still about a continent we could deal with its problems. These problems in Africa, Africa's problems, how do you deal with them? How can we help Africa, the people of Africa? But they were not things that had to do with us. And sometimes you can be where you are, and I'm not talking about what your ethnic origin is now. The moment you live in Europe, I speak to myself as well, and enjoy basic, you know, good standards of living, you can forget what is going on really in other parts and become a narrator of that experience. Of course, some of us can't just become narrators because those who are affected more often than not have families, friends, and so on. So they touch you in different ways. But intellectually, you can observe, do research, and do the analysis away from the problem. They're not coming to your doorstep anytime now. In those countries, by the way, as I close the conversation about Africa, people in the cities too can be far removed from the problem. Because in Sierra Leone, for example, all that crisis as it was happening in the hinterland and people were advancing towards the city through the violent conflict in Sierra Leone, as in Liberia, they started far away from the capital. And I was in Sierra Leone in 1986, or was it 80s, in the late 80s, when the rumblings of these things were happening. And people would say, it is those guys far away until it knocks on your door in the city before you know what is happening. Keep that at the back. Let's keep that at the back of our minds. Let's talk about fortress Europe and very fortress America, where, as far as the world was concerned, the conversation about the terms on which people would live together was settled. Where decent people, there's only one element of conversation I will use to connect this later, where decent people, civilized people engage in debates. After all, we had the public sphere in particular ways. We've been having conversations in Europe for centuries. Those violent conversations were long gone. In the medieval times, we waged wars, but since 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia has settled it for us. We're sovereign states. And when we started thinking about political philosophy and some of the conversations we had in the public sphere, it was possible to think about the various ways in which we will govern life in common. The issue of violence between those states was far from settled initially, but then we started coming up with debates and political philosophy which we enacted in different ways in different parts of Europe. So it was possible for Hobbes to think about the way in which to govern life in common. It was possible for John Locke to talk about the idea of the general will. And of course, in peace terms, it was possible for Immanuel Kant to come up with the ideal, the notion of perpetual peace, which can be granted to us because we're talking about republics, not just democracies, because democracies can still wield some sort of violence within them. Those were fantastic ideals, and you cannot talk about the notion of peace and stable peace in 2017 without revisiting those. But there were conversations that took place in Europe at particular moments. And therefore, the idea that democratic states do not go to war is a settled issue in Europe. It's a settled issue amongst so-called mature democracies. But what has remained unsettled is the ever-changing dynamics, is the continuum of the conversation that citizens must have within their borders and outside their borders, always. And every generation has its own conversation. And therefore, you have to think, when you're thinking about leadership, when you're thinking about peace, about Johann Galtung and how he then looks at the structure of society and the idea that violence can be structured. You do not have to suffer direct violence. So I cast your mind back on your behalf, all right, to Africa, where those conversations are about the structure of society and who's excluded and the nature of power and leadership in that place. Even in Europe, where we think it is a settled issue, we're now being reminded that somehow those conversations can have notions of silence. Silence because somehow using the very mechanisms through where we talk and talk back, and through the systems that we create for governing life in common, we have gradually missed populations who have a different narrative and who were using the same narrative of inclusion to exclude. It's a real conversation. And so when people are silent for a long time, because somehow they don't feel a part of this governing life in common in the way that they see others feeling it, and we do not revisit those conversations and we wait only till elections, which are good things to do because that's when your voice can be heard, or referenda, you have a plebiscite to really see what is happening to people. When you allow that to happen, which you must, then you see how the conversation is taking place. Brexit and what might be Frexit, some of you will hope not, some of us will hope not, and all those dynamics are about a new kind of conversation taking place in Europe. Let's park that. And I will not talk too much. I don't want this conversation to be about Trump because I'm sure people on this panel will deal with all of those things. Let's take the United States. All right? The third conversation here is about what went on in the States. And there's several points of connection and disconnection that I would just call attention to in headline form. The conversation did not just start now. It started about a decade ago when those who were part of the conversation from the sidelines started participating more in the central conversations. Think in all of these conversations, what they have in common is the idea of mainstream and margin, and the way in which we moderate mainstream and margin. The margins of the US participated in conversations that led to Barack Obama's election. The margins of the US also participated in conversations that led to the emergence of Trump. The connecting narrative between Brexit and Trumphalism is this. Both of them had leaders, I don't want to say imposters, had leaders who helped those people at the margin and their narratives come to the center. And the beauty of leadership, or maybe the worry about leadership, is it about mutually held goals. We always hope it's mutually held goals between people and their leaders, which will lead to positive outcomes. It's not news for leadership students that the outcomes are not always positive. But there was that exchange, mutuality, and some people captured the narratives very, very aptly. They read the margins, the narrative in the margins, and brought it to the center, and they emerged themselves as leaders. So the marginalized found a shared narrative, not a shared experience, but it is possible to capitalize on the narrative of the margins and bring it to the center in ways that are disruptive. But nonetheless, those people have spoken through the very, very processes, that they created. And I'm still optimistic that in Europe, in the UK, and in the US, that cyclical pattern of having very public conversations will allow us to always get people to speak again. It's not settled. The reason why Africa can no longer be, and this is where we talk about the contestations part of things. Those conversations had inherent contestation in them. In Africa, in Europe, it's about a contestation. If you like, call it between mainstream and margin, call it between classes, call it between all manner of social group, that is always going on. But that contestation in Europe, that contestation in Africa and in the States have produced some connecting dynamics. And I want us to now focus on those connecting dynamics. One of the dynamics is that the conversation crossed borders. You gradually began to see in Africa, in the Middle East, in certain parts of the world, contestations which were about extreme radical ideas. That's a form of conversation, though, as well. If you want to take the notion of conversation to the fullest, the connecting narrative among all of these continents is a conversation which produced a particular form of contestation. And therefore, the notion of radicalized violence is not the preserve of any of these continents, but they have all suffered it. That's a connecting narrative. That's the convergence of misfortune. You can also see the connecting narrative in the idea of migration. Migration itself is part of that conversation. I may choose to talk to my leaders by leaving the environment and not being part of that place. I may choose to pursue my idea of living well and living long in another place. I may choose to observe through a globalized process what a young person's life looks like in the next country, and I want to be part of it. The porosity of borders has been part of conversations in Africa for a long time. But even the borders have become porous and have reached Europe. But connecting narratives again, the conversation between global elite in Europe and the States and that in Africa. They had been having a closed conversation before. Now the conversation has been made very open. That closed conversation was, how do we help you? So you almost see a connivance between African leaders and the rest of Europe. Can you help us keep your people within the borders? Let's give you a few millions to do it. Do they even spend a few millions on their people? We have never, as Europeans and Americans, asked ourselves, what is it that makes a young person cross that dangerous territory and they find themselves in Lampedusa, or in the case of or those that go to Yemen? Why would somebody rather die? And they know they might die. One of our fellows had a brother who was, this was a few years back, who was going to cross to Yemen. And he asked his brother, why are you doing this? Who was not as gifted intellectually as him, and so could not find a way out in terms of education very easily. You're going to die crossing those high seas. And the guy said, I would rather die because I'm already dead in Ethiopia. That's what he told his brother. We saw only the places that were at war. We did not ask ourselves, what are we doing to enhance the lot of these people, their misfortunes? Because every time we trade with their leaders, every time we are in conferences with them and we give them money to support what we know is not going to trickle down to their people, we're enhancing that conversation. We're affecting that conversation. That's what has come out to the open. Radicalization, migration, development, collaboration, and the way it has connected the narrative of Africa and Europe in a very special way. And we have to see that actually, whether we like it or not, the reactions in the UK, where the marginalized were talking to their government, even though it was not about Europe, all right? It was a form of contestation. It resulted in exit from Europe. That was a leadership deficit, a big leadership deficit, and we don't have to return to it now. In the US as well, it's a different form of contestation in which particular kinds of leaders holding particular agendas saw a loophole, and they used it. It's a contestation because actually people voted. And whether we like the outcomes of it or not, people had a conversation through elections. Africans have had their conversations through everything: exclusion, terror, conflict, silence, mass protests. Migration, that's what it's about. But unfortunately for the people of Europe, the traveling migration has created a different thing and has affected their own debate. I wanted to open this conversation in that way for us to say that this is not a very usual debate we're having here today. It is not a debate just about Africa. It's a debate about Africa and its connections, permanent connections with the rest of the world, which we ignore at our own peril if we're going to stay in Europe and disconnect those conversations. And I want to participate very energetically in this debate because I myself want to take ideas away for the research I continue to do, because all of these things around conversation, contestation, and the convergence of the misfortunes of Africans, of ordinary Africans, of ordinary Europeans and ordinary Americans, all of this are about leadership. But for the first time, we have seen the agendas of ordinary people make it to center stage, for good or bad. We're listening to some of the narratives as disconnect, as disjointed as they might sound because of the other agendas that feed into it. I hope our panelists will tell us, offer us some kind of solutions or some kind of ideas in terms of how we think about all of this. And I'm sorry to have gone on for so long. I thought it was important to offer some kind of opening remarks that gets us thinking about the business of the African Leadership Center, the intellectual contributions it must make, the values it must insert in those spaces, and the policy decision-making that it must contribute to for this generation, because this generation of Africans and the rest of the world have to think differently about issues of their borders, their states, and the policies that their governments take, the policy decisions that they take over time. Thank you very, very much. Thanks.